And I'm more than pleased to welcome Dr. Martin Kapel, who is our special guest today. In case you hadn't already gathered, Martin is a Kindertransport survivor. So he came from Poland and Germany as part of the Kindertransport, which you know that there were lots of people, including Nicholas Winton, who saved people and children, particularly in that method. So we're very privileged to have him here because he's travelled a very long way. He got in a taxi at 8:30 this morning, especially to be with us, which we're very, very delighted about, and he will be going home again later, which I think for a gentleman of 86 years, which I don't think he'll mind me saying, is a great achievement, and we're very, very privileged to have him. So please, give your attention to Mr. Kapel.
Well, thank you very much, Lady Mayoress, ladies and gentlemen. One of the differences between a novelist and an historian is that a novelist can give every one of his or her stories a beginning and an end. But in real life, no story truly has a beginning or an end. Everything that happens is in some measure conditioned by what happened before, and everything that happens exerts some influence over subsequent events. So, when I tell you my story, I am not going to begin with my own personal experiences. I'm going to begin with events that occurred centuries before I was born, in order to give you the historical background. Now, in the 13th century, there was an age of great religious intolerance. Persecutions of Jews were nothing new, but by the 13th century, Christian Europe had for some time been in conflict with the Muslim Middle East in a series of wars known as the Crusades. And it seemed illogical to many people to send warriors all the way to the Middle East to fight those who were not Christians, whilst at the same time tolerating in their midst the Jews, who also were not Christians. So although persecution of Jews was nothing new, it had been going on for centuries, during the period of the Crusades, these persecutions reached a new height. Jews were constantly on the move, either because they had been forcibly expelled from their previous homes, or else because they had had to flee from them in fear of their lives. But then, in 1215, Europe experienced something completely new, an invasion which came from a different direction. Europe was invaded from the east by a fierce tribe of warriors who had come all the way from the frozen, barren lands that lie to the north of China. Properly, they should be referred to as the Mongols, although sometimes, less correctly, they are referred to as the Tartars. Now, in that frozen, barren terrain, agriculture was impossible. And in their homeland, the Mongols lived by having animals which provided them with meat and milk. But that meant that they had to feed the animals. And in the absence of agriculture, the only way of doing that was by turning the animals loose on patches of grass that grew wild. But in that frozen, barren land, such patches of grass were rare, and when they did occur, they were small. The animals would quickly eat the grass, and therefore the Mongols had to move with their animals to find fresh grazing. In other words, they could not live a settled existence, living in houses. They had to live as nomadic herdsmen, living in tents made of animal skins. Yet in the early 13th century, the Mongols began a tremendous war of invasion. Some of them went southwards and conquered China and the country that has variously been known as either Burma or Myanmar. Others went westwards and conquered Russia and Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. But as they went to more favorable climates, they found farmers who farmed land that either they or some landlord claimed to own, and they found villagers and citizens who lived in houses standing on land that either they or some landlord claimed to own. The nomadic herdsmen thought the land belonged to everybody. No one, according to their way of thinking, had the right of exclusive and permanent ownership of land. And so, as the Mongols progressed, they ruthlessly destroyed all farms, villages, towns, and cities that lay in their path. By the year 1225, they stood menacingly on the borders of what was later to become Germany. But that was as far as they got. There, for various reasons, they had to withdraw. They briefly came back in 1240, but in 1241 they finally withdrew from their outlying conquests, which included, amongst other places, Poland. Yet, when they withdrew from Poland, they left that country completely devastated and in large measure depopulated. Subsequent kings of Poland faced the problem of rebuilding their country and restocking it with population. For that purpose, they paid either noblemen or other people of influence in Central Europe to go around and recruit people to come to Poland and, as pioneers, help to rebuild the country. There is a theory, although it is only one of several rival theories, but a very feasible one, that it was this recruitment process that gave Europe one of its most picturesque legends, that of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. But the kings of Poland couldn't afford to be too particular about whom they chose. They had to take whatever people they could get. And although they themselves were Christians, who in that age of religious bigotry probably hated the Jews as much as anybody, they couldn't afford to be particular. They had to accept even Jews. For the Jews, this was a completely new experience. In Central Europe, they were persecuted, they were hounded from place to place. But now, here were the kings of Poland actually inviting them in. And so many Jews left Central Europe and went to live in Eastern Europe, including Poland. They took with them the German language. But over the centuries, languages changed. And since in those days one didn't have the efficient methods of communication that we have today, over the centuries, the German spoken by Jews in Eastern Europe began to differ from the German spoken in Central Europe, until it became a different language, recognizably Germanic in origin, but not the same as German. It is the language known as Yiddish. Well, time went on, Poland was rebuilt, and for some centuries it became one of the great powers of Europe. That meant that in Poland the Jews were no longer needed, and they began to suffer persecution as elsewhere. Eventually, in the 18th century, the power of Poland declined. In the late 18th century, Poland suffered 3 disastrous invasions. In the first 2, it lost some territory. In the third one, it was divided up altogether. And as a political entity, it ceased to exist. But all this resulted in a great deal of misfortune for the Polish people, they needed a scapegoat, and a convenient scapegoat was furnished by the Jews. And so we find that in the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, persecutions of Jews once again in Eastern Europe once again became particularly severe. These persecutions even acquired a special name, the Russian word for devastation, pogrom. Now, as a result of these so-called pogroms, many Jews tried to leave Poland. Some of them were able to get right away to a newly formed country that had established itself on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States. Others couldn't get as far as that. They went to various places in Europe, including Britain, but a favorite destination was Germany. And that had two reasons. One was that Germany was a neighboring country, it was easy to get to, and the other was the language. It was still possible for someone who spoke Yiddish to understand quite a bit of German, and for someone who spoke German to understand quite a bit of Yiddish. So it came about that Germany acquired a very considerable number of Polish Jews. They were not allowed to take German citizenship. Whilst Poland as a political entity did not exist, they were classed as stateless. But after the First World War, when Poland once again became a country, they were given Polish citizenship. According to the laws of both Poland and Germany, a child that was born took its nationality from its parents, not its birthplace. So the children of these people also became Polish citizens. Now, in the early years of the 20th century, my father, traveling by himself, made this migration from Poland to Germany. A few years earlier, my mother's family had done the same. The two people who were eventually to become my parents first met each other in Germany, and after their marriage, they settled in Germany in the city of Leipzig. But they were Polish citizens. And when I was born in Leipzig, although that was in Germany, I was also officially a Polish citizen. Now, that is the beginning of my story. But at that time, there was no reason why Jews shouldn't live in Germany. Of course, there was a certain amount of prejudice, there was some discrimination, there were employers who wouldn't employ Jews, there were Jews who were in employment but couldn't get promotions. There was that sort of thing. But for the time being, there was nothing a great deal worse. There was a political party that was fiercely anti-Semitic, the Nazis, and they made a great deal of noise, but they were not as yet the government of Germany. When I was a very small boy, the Nazis did become the government of Germany, and immediately life for Jews became progressively more and more unpleasant. When I was 5 years old, my father was killed in an accident. It had nothing to do with the Nazis. It was a very tragic accident. And so I continued to live with my mother and my elder sister. Because of my father's death, of course, the family's finances were severely affected, and we got permission from the owners of the house in which we occupied the flat to sublet part of our flat. Our subtenants were a middle-aged couple who were also Polish Jews. When I was 6 years old, in accordance with German law, I had to go to school. And I simply went to the local school. But 2 years later, the law was changed. Jewish children were no longer allowed to go to non-Jewish schools. And so I had to go to a Jewish school, which was a very long way from my home. That was the reason why I hadn't gone there originally. Now, I have sometimes been asked, if things were getting worse and worse for Jews in Germany, why didn't the Jews simply leave? Well, there was a good reason for that. With certain exceptions, no one would let them in. Every country in those years had a severe unemployment problem. If it allowed in refugees, either they would be unemployed and be a burden on the state, or else they would take a job that somebody else could have had, and that other person would be a burden on the state. There were exceptions. Eminent scientists, doctors, people like that, they, in some cases, could gain access to another country because they were needed. There were also some people who had family members in other countries, and in some cases, the family members were in a position to guarantee to maintain them financially, so that they wouldn't have to work and take somebody else's job. But, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. A few people like that were able to get away from Germany. But for the majority of Jews in Germany, there was no such escape. One simply had to remain. My own life changed suddenly on the 28th of October, 1938. Very early in the morning, we were all asleep in our beds when there came a sudden ringing of the doorbell. It was a persistent ringing of the doorbell, and my mother got up and answered the door. The Nazis entered our flat. We were ordered to get up immediately and dress. We could only snatch a few things that we could find on the spur of the moment, and we were carefully watched to make sure that we took nothing of value, although we didn't actually possess very many things of great value, and we were taken away. We didn't know where we were being taken. At first, we were taken on foot to a small police station that was only a few streets away, and there we waited, not knowing what we were waiting for. Eventually, a bus drew up outside the police station. In Leipzig, a bus was a rather unusual sight. Public transport was by trams, and whenever one saw a bus, it had always been specially chartered for some particular purpose, as indeed this one had. We were told to get onto the bus, which already contained some other Jewish people who had been taken from other parts of the city. We were driven to the railway station, and there we joined what certainly to me as a child looked like a very large crowd of Jewish people who had similarly been taken away at some time that morning. I was familiar with that railway station. I had travelled from it on many different occasions, and this time I noticed a difference. Normally, on a large railway station, one would expect to see 1 or 2 policemen, just to make sure that everything was in order. But on this occasion, there were many policemen, and there were also many men who wore the black uniform of the Nazi organization known as the SS. In normal circumstances, the police in Germany, as indeed in most European countries, carried revolvers as a matter of routine. But on this occasion, many of these policemen also carried rifles, as did many, if not indeed all, of the SS men. We were ordered to get onto a train which had obviously been specially chartered for the purpose. And round about 11 o'clock in the morning, the train moved off. We didn't know where we were being taken or for what purpose. A little later, the train stopped at a station and more prisoners were put on board. Somebody somehow discovered that the doors were locked. Normally, before a train moved off, the doors would all be closed for obvious safety reasons, but on this occasion they were also locked. And when the word got round, some people, out of curiosity, tried the door handles. The doors were indeed locked. But when one tried a door handle from the inside, the handle outside also moved. So people on the platform could see that the door handles were being tried. This brought a policeman into our carriage, and although he spoke in German, his words translated into English were, "If you try to escape," as he put it, "use will be made of the firearms." We knew that we had better not try the door handles again. The train moved on and stopped at a few more places, and other prisoners were put on board. We talked to some of the other passengers. Some people who knew their geography realized that the direction in which we were moving was towards the east, although we didn't know what our destination would be and what would happen to us when we got there. But on talking to other passengers, we also discovered that we were more fortunate than some. We had been taken very early in the morning as an entire family. Some people had been taken later in the morning after husbands had left for work and children had left for school. Wives were taken from the home, husbands from the workplace, children from the school. They didn't know whether they would ever meet one another again. And we were more fortunate in another respect as well. We were young and we were reasonably healthy. But some of the other people were of all ages. There were mothers carrying babies. There were people in extreme old age. There were also sick people. Some of the people had not been taken from home, but had been taken out of hospital beds. The journey was going to be much more difficult for them. Eventually, it became dark, but the train continued on its journey until it reached a small railway station where the doors were unlocked and we were ordered to get off the train. We were directed towards the station exit. As we moved along through the station, I happened to notice the station clock. It said 10 minutes to midnight. To me, as a small boy, that was remarkable. I wasn't usually allowed to stay up for that length of time. But of course, these were exceptional circumstances. Outside the station, there were 2 lines of SS men. We walked between them, and they formed us up in rows. As far as I remember, although I cannot be 100% sure, there were 4 of us in each row, but there was 1 SS man at each end of each row. And we were marched off. Again, we had no idea where to. We were very quickly outside this small town and in one of the forests that one gets in Germany. Of course, on a narrow forest path, the rows became a bit ragged, but we were still walking between two lines of SS men. Some of the SS men carried torches by which they could see their way, but there were no torches for us. And walking in the dark along a forest path was very difficult. The path was uneven. It was easy to stumble, particularly for people like very old people, or sick people, or people carrying babies. It was very easy to fall, but falling was dangerous. If someone fell, the SS men would not allow the rest of us to stop. Those behind would not know that anyone in front had fallen, and anyone who fell was in serious danger of being trampled. I was later to find out that we were not the only group of people being marched. In the vicinity and in other parts of Germany, there were similar events going on. The total number of people involved has been variously estimated. I have heard estimates as low as 10,000, but I've also heard estimates as high as 17,000. The truth is probably somewhere between those limits. But I have also read that either through falling or through old people or sick people collapsing or otherwise, something like 400 people lost their lives during these marches. I have no way of verifying whether that figure is accurate or not, but it does at least seem a feasible figure in view of my recollections of events. Eventually, we came to a railway line. Here we were stopped, and we were told that the SS men would go no further. From now on, we were on our own, but we were warned not to walk beside the railway line because there were ditches, and in the dark, we would fall into the ditches. We were warned to walk between the rails. We were told that there was no train due to come, and that turned out to be true. Whether that was simply because no train was scheduled, or whether that railway line was disused, I don't know. But we now faced another difficulty, even in the absence of the SS men. Walking between railway lines in the dark is very difficult. There are the wooden sleepers that one can fall over. Between the wooden sleepers, there is the clinker-like material known technically as ballast. And it was very easy, once again, to fall, especially if one was already exhausted, as many of the elderly people and sick people were, or if one was carrying something as delicate as a baby. And although the SS men were no longer there to force us to walk on, nevertheless, it was very difficult to stop the momentum of a whole trainload of people walking when those behind didn't know that someone in front had fallen. We walked for quite a time, and then those who were at the front of the column saw some lights somewhere over to the left. They left the railway line and walked towards the lights, and the rest of us followed. We walked across a field, and we came to a small hamlet. One could hardly call it a village. It was only a group of just a few houses. And there we simply stopped and sat down on the ground because we didn't know what else to do. As we arrived in this small hamlet, I could see on the horizon the first signs of dawn. This gives you an approximate idea of how long we had been walking at the end of October. Now, we waited, not really knowing what we were waiting for. Somehow, somebody must have alerted the authorities to our presence. We were, in fact, in Poland. We had crossed the frontier. When the authorities realized that we were there, soldiers and police came to take us away. They gave us a rather hostile reception. For one thing, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism in Poland. For another thing, they regarded us as being illegal immigrants. We hadn't gone through immigration and customs in a normal way when one travels from one country to another, but of course we had had no choice in the matter. It wasn't our fault. Anyway, they took us away, and for the next 2 or 3 days we were moved from one place to another. I have individual recollections of various places, but I can no longer recall the exact sequence of events. It all seemed so mystifying at the time. What in fact was happening was that the Polish authorities wanted to return us to Germany, but the Germans were ready for that. I now know that they did succeed in forcing a few people back into Germany, but the majority of us remained in Poland. Now, I know now that many of us were sent to a place called Zbąszyn, which was right on the border, and the Polish authorities wanted to send people from there back into Germany when an opportunity offered itself. But some of us managed by various means to get away. We ourselves managed to get away to Krakow, where we had some relations. Now, my relations in Poland belonged to the Hasidic form of Judaism. The Hasidim are the extremely Orthodox Jews. We were Orthodox at home in Leipzig, but not Hasidic. But for the first time, I experienced a Hasidic lifestyle. The Hasidim lived in a self-imposed poverty, devoting their lives as much as possible to religious practice and religious study. They, of course, had to earn enough to remain alive, but they wanted no more than that. For them, the ultimate goal was religious study and religious observance. They were poor people, but nevertheless they were hospitable towards us, and they did their best for us. We remained in Krakow for something like 7 or 7.5 months, and then we moved to a small village called Wijgerden. It's about 20 or 30 miles from Krakow, where we had some more relations who also were Hasidim. They also lived in this sort of self-imposed poverty, devoting their lives to religious observance and religious study. But of course this was village life, which was rather different from city life. And again, I experienced that. Whilst all this was going on, however, there were people in other countries who were aware of the fact that terrible things were happening in Germany. And some of them lobbied governments, saying, we know you have a severe unemployment problem, we know you don't want to add to it by admitting a lot of refugees, but will you at least save some of the children? They won't add to the unemployment problem. The governments of a few countries agreed. Unfortunately, some of those countries, like France and the Netherlands, were later to be occupied by the Germans during the Second World War, and the children who went there fell into German hands again. I think very few of them will have survived. But another government that agreed to take children was the government of Britain. The British government agreed on certain conditions. One condition was that no part of the cost and no part of the organizational burden was to fall on the British taxpayer. If either individuals or charities were prepared to finance the project and to organize it, then the government would agree to admit children. There were at that time still people who doubted whether a Second World War would come. They thought it might just be a temporary emergency. And so for each child that came, the government insisted that the sum of £50 should be deposited with the Home Office to pay for repatriation when the emergency was over. Later, when it became clear that it was not just a temporary emergency, the government dropped that requirement. At first, the government allowed these children to live either with foster parents or in hostels. But later, when it became clear that the Second World War was very likely to begin, they insisted that children who came after that should go to foster parents. It was realized that hostels might be needed for British children who had to be evacuated from cities in danger of bombing. Well, most of the children who came on one of these so-called Kindertransports came directly from Germany or from Austria. As I think is well known, there was at the time a British businessman who later to be knighted, Sir Nicholas Winton, who I'm sorry to say recently died, who managed to save 669 children from Czechoslovakia. But there were also a few Kindertransports from Poland. They were all for children who had taken part in the forced expulsion of Polish Jews from Germany. They were not for children who had lived in Poland all their lives. My sister and I were fortunate to get a place on a Kindertransport, which brought us to England, where we arrived on the 18th of July 1939, just 6 weeks before the war began. We were to go to foster parents, but we knew nothing about our foster parents. We didn't even know their name. We didn't know whether they were Jewish or not. In the event, they were not. We didn't know whether they would be able to speak German or Yiddish. They couldn't. They spoke only English, and we could not speak English. But when we arrived in London, because the Kindertransport from Poland arrived in the port of London, it did not arrive in Harwich as the other Kindertransports did. My foster mother was there to meet us. My foster father, of course, was at work. In those days, when one didn't have the modern labor-saving devices in the home, it was very unusual for married women to have a paid occupation. So my foster father was at his work. My foster mother came to meet us, and as we were to discover, not only could she not understand German, but she was in fact very hard of hearing and found it difficult even to understand spoken English, so she was accompanied by her sister. She met us, and later that day we were brought by train to Coventry, where my foster parents lived. And this started up a completely new chapter in my life. Being in a strange country with strange people was itself a terrifying experience, especially when one couldn't speak the language, and as I discovered, neither my foster parents nor their friends and neighbors could speak our language. So therefore, we had to learn the language. But there were also more subtle differences. The way of life here was very different from that to which I was accustomed in Germany, and even more different from that which I had seen in Poland. There were many problems which I didn't understand. The ways of English people were baffling to me, but of course my ways were equally baffling to them. But as a child, I had by law to go to school. And so soon after arrival, I went to school. And being at school, I of course couldn't understand the lessons that were being taught, but I heard the English language being spoken all the time. And gradually I began to associate various words with various meanings. I began to pick up little points of grammar. They weren't always correct. I had sometimes to unlearn what I had learned and learn it properly. But nevertheless, I began to learn more and more. Now, today, it is not uncommon for a school teacher to meet a child whose native language isn't English. This is commonplace in schools today. But in those days, it was almost unheard of. And yet, these teachers had such a clear understanding of children that they knew exactly how to handle the situation. I was put into a class of boys who were a year younger than I was. I should explain that in those days, very few schools took both boys and girls. They were either boys' schools or girls' schools. And naturally, I went to a boys' school. But they put me into a class of boys who were a year younger than I. And I was in that class for a term. And then they decided that I now understood enough English to be able to move up to a class of boys of my own age, where I would learn more English and also learn something of what was being taught. Altogether, I found that in both schools that I attended, I was treated very well, both by the staff and by the other boys. I have every admiration for the way in which they handled the situation. But, first of all, there were other difficulties, not just for me, but for everybody else. The Second World War, of course, began. And, as everybody knows, British cities were bombed. People argue about which was the most heavily bombed city in the country. Well, there's no clear answer, because it depends on the criterion that you apply. Are you talking about the number of people killed, or the proportion of the population killed, or the number of tons of bombs dropped, or the number of tons of bombs per unit area, or various things like that? But by every such criterion, there are certain cities that are always either at the top or very near the top. And Coventry, of course, was one of them. Coventry, at first, had a number of small air raids, and then, on the night of the 14th to the 15th of November 1940, it had a very, very big air raid. It was not to be the only big air raid that Coventry had. There was another raid which perhaps was not quite as big, but nevertheless was very big, in April of 1941, and there were other very big, there were other big raids and many small raids. Coventry was indeed very heavily bombed. And this talk gives me an opportunity to dispel one of the myths that have got around about the bombing of Coventry. There was, before the war, a certain commercial organization which had specialized in testing public reaction to various products that firms were marketing and that sort of thing. During the war, they started to send to the appropriate government departments reports on the reaction of the British people to the various difficulties of war, such as bombing, food rationing, and things like that. As far as I am aware, they had no official standing. I believe they did all this entirely of their own bat. But when the government departments received the reports, what did they do with them? They filed them. The reports went into the archives, and some of these reports have subsequently been retrieved from the archives by historians. Now, this organization, on the big raid on Coventry, which occurred in November 1940, did not have any of its members in Coventry, but some of them came the following day. They found it difficult to get into the city because many of the roads were blocked, some by debris from collapsed buildings, some by bomb craters in the road itself, some by bombs which had fallen but not exploded and might explode at any moment. So these people outside the city noticed that a large number of people were being taken out of the city in lorries, some of them army lorries, others lorries belonging to various civilian organizations. They wrote in their report that the bombing of Coventry had caused what they called mass panic, and that many people were running away in what they called an unorganized rout. Now, on the day after that air raid, I walked through quite a lot of Coventry. I saw no panic. I did see people being taken out, but these were people who had lost their homes. It was a November night, there was a sharp frost. If these people had simply sat down on the ground and waited for morning, they would have frozen to death. The logical thing, rational thing to do, was to go to some of the surrounding villages and ask people to shelter them. Of course, in peacetime, people wouldn't normally allow a stranger into their homes like that, but in wartime, they would. And many of the people who left the city that way came back the following day to do what they could to try to get the city going again. It wasn't a mass panic. It wasn't an unorganized rout. It was the rational thing to do. And unfortunately, these words, mass panic and unorganized rout, have found their way into some history books. I can assure you there's no truth in them whatsoever. But there is something else that I would like to say. I referred to going to school, and I went to that school until I was 11 years old, and then, of course, came the time for me to go to a different school. Now, for 11-year-olds, there were three possibilities. The majority of children went to what was called a senior elementary school. A few children who had achieved a certain standard in an examination could go to a central advanced school. And another group of children who had achieved a higher standard could go to what in those days was called a secondary school. Later, the secondary schools were to be called secondary grammar schools. Now, if one went to a secondary school, not only did one have to pass the examination, but one also either had to pay fees or else pass the examination at a sufficiently high standard to obtain a scholarship. In my case, there was, of course, the problem was I eligible for a scholarship? The majority of the scholarships were given by the local authority, and whether they would allow a foreigner to obtain a scholarship or not was entirely at their discretion. They would have been legally entitled to say no. But the Education Authority of Coventry wasn't like that. It said that I was eligible. If I achieved the appropriate standard in the examination, they were prepared to give me a scholarship. And the result was that I was able to go to the secondary school. And years later, when I had finished there, the same problem arose again. Could I go to a university? Of course I had to pass the necessary examinations, that goes without saying. But who was going to pay for it? My foster parents were in no position to pay. There was a system of scholarships offered by the Ministry of Education, the so-called state scholarships, but foreigners were not allowed to have those. There were local authority scholarships, but again, whether I was eligible or not was entirely at the discretion of the local authority. And the local authority of Coventry again said yes. So I owe a great debt to the local authority of Coventry, and I am pleased to acknowledge this. Not only did they give me an opportunity to go to a secondary school, but later they gave me the opportunity to go to a university. And my subsequent career would have been impossible if the local authority of Coventry had refused me to compete for these scholarships. I owe them a very great debt, and I am pleased to acknowledge that. Lady Mayoress, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.